Good morning, everyone. Let's get ready for a talk about wicked problems and the people who solve them. First of all, very many thanks to our gracious hostess, Julia. Her vision has allowed for a very important space in this panel, a discussion on the health of our ocean and what do we need to do to maintain and preserve the blue heart of the planet, the sea. Jim.
Thanks for being here. Thanks for caring. I'm going to give you a little bit of background about what goes on in the ocean related to CO2 emissions in the atmosphere. But before I kind of get into the details of that, to set the stage, I'd like to just briefly touch on some of the ecosystem services that we depend upon for our very lives. And certainly climate stability, the heat sink of the ocean, is the most important factor, that we wouldn't be here without that heat sink. Water is purified by the ocean for us and delivers it as rainfall in the mountains. Every other breath we breathe is oxygen produced by marine phytoplankton, so about half the oxygen on Earth is produced. Biodiversity, in addition to fisheries resources, we depend upon biodiversity for all sorts of things. It's a biological storehouse for potential compounds that can be important for pharmaceuticals, for materials science, and that repository is something we exploit heavily. Food is the most obvious. We depend upon roughly 10% of the protein on Earth that we consume is produced by ocean resources. Shoreline protection, coral reefs, mangrove swamps, all of these things are key for us. But what happens when we change the atmosphere, and how does the ocean respond? Well, really 4 things happen. Global warming that we've heard about a lot, ocean acidification, which is a change in the carbonate chemistry of the ocean, deoxygenation of the deeper waters of the ocean, reduced oxygen levels, and obviously sea level rise as both the water expands and glaciers melt. Now, one other thing I want to mention is plastics. We're going to hear a lot more about plastics today, and even plastics can contribute to these emissions. There's a recent paper by Sarah Royer and other colleagues at the University of Hawaii showing that as plastics degrade, some of them can emit methane, ethylene, and other greenhouse active gases. Now, you've seen some of the data, that little table there that shows us in 1850 we were at about 250 parts per million, or 280 parts per million, and now we're at 412. I got the same number that Paul Hawken did. I checked the site a couple days ago, and we're heading into an uncertain future that we need to consider very carefully. So, ocean warming. When you warm those surface layers, warm water is lighter than cold water. So that surface layer wants to float above that colder layer below it. And all of the oxygen that in the ocean enters through the surface, either through air-sea gas exchange or by the production of oxygen by marine plants and phytoplankton. And the deep waters of the ocean gain oxygen through the wind-driven and other mixing of waters from the surface down. When you warm that surface layer, wind blowing across the surface doesn't mix it as effectively. So over the last 30 years, all of the surveys of the deep waters of the ocean in every ocean basin that we've looked at show lower oxygen concentrations, and that's expanding. And that can be stressful for marine organisms at times, depending upon what their thresholds are for survival. Ocean acidification. I'm not going to go into the chemistry, the very brief chemistry you see there, other than saying that when CO2 reacts with water, rainfall, seawater, rivers, even our own within our cells, it is hydrated by water and forms carbonic acid that we all know as soda pop. And then that has some important changes that affect marine organisms, especially changes in the acidity of the ocean with a more acidic ocean as we move into the future, as well as a reduction in some of the mineral levels that are important to make calcium carbonate shells and skeletons. And that doesn't mean they can't make them anymore, but it may mean that it's more energetically expensive for them, or that it'll actually begin to dissolve some of the calcium carbonate that's existing. Now, so global warming is happening, obviously, and we've heard a lot about this. This is just a projection with a couple scenarios, one of them moving up into the future with the red lines, and that's kind of the trajectory we are on, and we would love to stabilize. We've heard a lot about the ongoing consequences of what we see as climate change consequences. And although they're incredibly important, and we've seen this devastations that's occurred in some areas, if you look at the baseline, we're at 2019 here on this graph. We have just left the baseline, and depending upon how we treat our our emissions, we're going to head up into a very different world, or hopefully stabilize. But what we've seen now is just a prelude to something that could be far worse. So action obviously is required. Now, ocean acidification. This top graph is the same graph that Paul Hawkins showed, showing the ice core data from Antarctica or Greenland or both. And those are CO2 concentrations rising and falling. The blue areas show us where we've had ice ages. And then we have this step into the future where we're moving up to an area where we haven't seen before. If you take those same data, and we've done some calculations just to measure ocean acidity, how will ocean acidity in the surface ocean change along those lines? And we see basically the reverse. As we emit more CO2, we get more carbonic acid. We'll see a change into the future that's shown in the context of this 400,000-year ice core record, but I could show you more data that go back 25 million years that show that this is just basically like stepping off a cliff into a new ocean chemistry that has not been present for at least 25 million years. One more little tidbit about that is that if you look at the rate that we're changing it and the magnitude, some ocean chemists think that this may be the biggest, most rapid change in environmental change in the ocean in up to 250 million years. So this is a huge event. So what do you do? And there are lots of options, really 4 options for organisms that are faced with any sort of environmental change. You can migrate if you're a fish, or your population can move to another location where the conditions may be more habitable. We see this a lot. Some of my research, a lot of research over the world has shown that there's been a redistribution of species, a shifting of fisheries, especially in the North Sea toward the north. Atlantic cod are moving north, and Arctic cod are being pressed up further north, but they can't go very far because they already live all the way to the pole. And this reshuffling of the distribution of organisms might have unforeseen or really poorly understood changes for the function of those ecosystems. Acclimation. We can adjust to some extent to new conditions, and some part of the population of all organisms may be able to tolerate those new conditions. If that tolerance is heritable, through evolution, you might see adaptation. And so we hope that some of the species out here are going to be able to adapt both fast enough and far enough to match the pace of environmental change that we're pressing. And the final option there is usually what happens, extinction. And if you look at Earth history, and at the very last slide, if I have time, I'll show a bit of Earth history showing that all of these mass extinctions that we've seen over Earth history have been driven by, or at least associated with, environmental change. So what happens in the world? We have about 1 in 3 people depend on the oceans for food in one way or another. For 500 million people, they depend solely on the ocean for their livelihoods, and maybe 30 million in the Coral Triangle depend upon fish from the reefs in front of them. What's happening to reefs across the world? Well, if you plot coral reefs, this is what we see. That's where existing reefs occur. And if you just take those that have been bleached up to 2012, this is the consequence of those options that we've talked about. The corals that you see in red here, the dots you see in red, are areas that have been bleached. And we have lost 20%, 30% of reefs across the world already. In Earth history, we see that during mass extinction events, we lose coral reefs. And they come back in about 1,000,000 years, 100,000 to 1,000,000 years. So the Earth will recover, no problem, but it's the quality of life for us that we have to worry about. So we try to figure out how different organisms might respond to more CO2, warming, whatever it is. But what we really need to maintain the ecosystem services we depend upon are healthy marine food webs. You can see the green, all these lines are connections between these food webs, but the green line is basically running from primary producers, the grasses of the ocean, the phytoplankton. That energy has to be transformed through the food web into the things that we really care about on the right. Fisheries, tourism, ecotourism, whales, birds. That's what we want to make sure we maintain. Not so many people care about the middle, but they are critical. And here's one example. Sea butterflies, like Limacina, is an animal that lives off our coast. It's a marine snail that has a shell. It lives in midwater, floats around. It can be more than 90% of the diets of some salmon. We also know that right now, off the coast of California and further north, because waters are becoming more corrosive, the shells of these organisms are beginning to melt right now in the wild, not in a lab. So what happens if we move to the future and we see that we've lost marine pteropods. Will there be another species of small or large zooplankton that will have an equivalent ecological role, basically coming in as a sub when somebody's injured? Maybe that's fine. And then we can continue to have this flow of energy through the food web. But what if we start to change things enough that we knock out whole guilds within this food web? How does energy then move to one organism that's poised, that's there doing just fine because it's consuming phytoplankton, but the squid, it's too small for the squid. There's a break in the food web, break in that chain. And then the one thing we know is that if everything goes to hell, the microbes will win. So the slime always wins one way or another. But the concern is that we need to make sure we don't go too far in terms of environmental change to disrupt whole ecosystems. Now, just to finish up, we've got just like this fish that's going, what should I do here? We have the same conundrum. What should we do? And I don't think we know what we need to do. We need to reduce carbon and stabilize the climate. And we have lots of options that we've heard about today and yesterday that we need to, what everyone said already, we need to move forward and start implementing these on large scales. Now, the last slide in the lower right there, you can see the 600 million year history of the fossil record on Earth. And don't worry about the colors, but the rise is the rise in the number of marine families, groups of organisms that live in the ocean. And you can see it rises up, and then those pink lines show us the 5 major mass extinctions on Earth, each of which was associated with some massive environmental change, usually volcanism. The biggest was the 250 million years ago, the Permian-Triassic boundary, where about 90% of life on Earth died. And that was associated with massive volcanism off Siberia that went on for 100,000 or more years, raised CO2 levels very high in the atmosphere, and led to extinction. We timed it right. We live in a period of relatively very stable climate. So no big deal. We're living in the good times, and we have to make sure that we don't allow the perturbations in climate to be so severe that we really lose the species that we have that we'll have to depend upon for the next, I don't know, the rest of our lives certainly, and hopefully humans will be around. We have also heard about the Anthropocene and how we're undergoing the 6th major mass extinction. That's not really related to climate change. That's more related to habitat loss, overharvesting, and other things that we're doing that are sort of an assault on the biota of the Earth. We don't want to add climate change as another driver of an extinction period. Let's make sure we start to implement these options. And I'll stop there, and we'll move to the next speaker. Thank you.
Thank you.
Who's next?
You don't need it, right?
Thank you. I don't know about everybody else in this room, but when I see that slide, the corals, the red dots, it's really emotional. It's a really good visualization of the effect. It's hard, right, if you haven't been diving to really understand what's going on. And the world is so big, and we're very lucky if we get to spend some time on various continents, but most people don't. So I thank you for that, because it's a good visualization. My name's Emma Riley. I run strategic partnerships, marketing, creative for an organization called Sea Legacy, which was founded by Paul Nicklin and Christina Mittermeier, 2 really brilliant content captures and creators. And I feel very grateful to be here. Thank you, Julia. We've known each other for a few years, and I'm really inspired by your putting this together. I recently relocated to the Bay Area from New York, and it was really hard to breathe for a while this past fall, literally. For about 2 weeks, wasn't it? Yeah. We were 2.5 hours away in Oakland, which is where I live. And there were moments where it just felt like we were a part of the apocalypse. Every other breath we take is coming from our ocean. So even in moments in which we feel like we're part of a situation that cannot be solved, and we're having trouble breathing, every other breath we're taking is coming from that which is working, which is at risk of no longer working, in the ocean. So how do you talk about that? How do you get that to an audience? How do you engage an audience in a way in which they don't necessarily need to shift their lives to feel as though they're a part of the solution? How many people in here watch movies? How many people in here go online? How many people in here have a cell phone? So how do you use the power of content to pull in an audience and not only expose and educate them to the fact that every other breath we take is due to our ocean, but inspire change, inspire action? We at Sea Legacy have an audience that reaches we reach 25 million people, that is our audience, on a daily basis. We pull those people in, and we do not say to them, give us money, we need you to be a part of work that we're producing, we're changing, we're teeing up. We say to them, join us. Join us, witness what we're witnessing, and then go to this organization or go to that organization. Sign up for this moment of change. Support this work. Be a part of producing this marine protected area. We see our power as creators, as creatives, as marketers, as advertisers, as a power that can inspire others to work with local communities, local efforts, and help support movements that otherwise would not move as quickly as they are. Collaboration is key to success. Collaboration is key to us all coming together. We would not all be here if Julia had not recognized that a way to speak to the effort was through pulling a handful of people together who are not necessarily speaking on the same issues and are not necessarily speaking to the fires directly, but are ultimately speaking to the same issue. We're ultimately here for the same reason. At Sea Legacy, again, we recognize that. And so we do not use our content that Paul pulls from the Arctic or that Christina pulls from the South Pacific, to generate action that we produce within our network, but rather we use it to further action developed by other networks. I'm going to show 2 videos. They're far more interesting than my standing up here and talking to you. The first is from a campaign we produced called Death Nets. Paul personally witnessed the devastation that was happening across the thin blue line here in California. And again, recognizing that we needed our global audience of 25 million we reach on a daily basis to support that effort, we thought as a team, let's get out there. Let's actually shoot and provide to those with cell phones, to those that watch films, to those that absorb content, what's happening to then push them away from us to another community and hopefully create some real change. So, my friend, if you could please play the Death Nets video, that would be wonderful. So you saw 12 days, signatures that would otherwise not have been collected. We recognize the power of collaboration. We recognize the power of content. And we recognize the power of pushing your audience to another network in order to inspire change in a much broader community. A second very short video that I'd like to show is a video of something that's going on right now in Norway. And it's something that we really need an entire community to become a part of through our network, again, which is a much broader network at its core. So if we could show the second video now, that'd be great.
The ocean now is just booming with life. It's totally unique in a world. Where would you find anything like this that as concentrated as it is here? I think that Lofoten kind of represents for Norwegian the image of Norwegian nature and how our culture is, because it has everything. Everything from the fjords to the big oceans to the mountains.
Most importantly, it's been the fishing breadbasket of Norway for thousands of years.
In the 50s, 60s, and especially the 70s here in Norway, the herring catch went down. The catches were just smaller and smaller to the point where it was collapsing. When that happens, everybody looks around for somebody to blame. And I think it came very natural to blame killer whales. Whalers went out and hunted killer whales. And the last 10 years before it was stopped, more than 700 killer whales were killed.
Since then, killer whales became protected. Quotas were in place for the herring fishery. Herring actually recovered, and killer whales have recovered too. This is probably the strongest and healthiest population of killer whales in the world.
We also have herring fishermen who are quite into the killer whales. I've seen fishermen posting pictures and video, and they're excited about it. I think the transition has mainly happened because a lot of people also from the outside have started coming in and saying, I have never seen anything like this. Your country is amazing. Your natural wonders are unparalleled.
There's a huge local pride that people come from all over the world to see what is here in northern Norway.
So then to risk all of that for oil, it's just beyond me that anyone can even imagine doing that. We've had this debate like every second year, every fourth year, because our politicians have never been brave enough to say no to the oil, permanently no. So yeah, so we won it, like we've won it 6 times, and still they're not giving up. But we can't have it that way, that we wait for every fourth year that insecurity comes back to us every time.
So we're here to try to appeal to Norwegians, to the government of Norway, to leave the oil in the ground and let this place be.
It's time now to say that it's permanent protection so that we know nothing will happen when we get a new government. That can give safety to the fishermen up there, and it can give safety to the people that's what will happen to this area.
If Norway manages to say, yes, we have a lot of oil in these fjords, but we know that we need to transition to renewable energy and we're going to leave that oil in the ground, I'm hoping that countries like Canada will follow suit. Just because you have a lot of oil doesn't mean you have to take it out of the ground. Today, our planet needs climate action, and part of that climate action is leaving that oil where it is and transitioning to a renewable energy future, quickly.
The public has been the clearest in wanting to protect this area, while the politicians, they are hesitant. We have to make sure that we give them the courage to take this brave decision and protect one of the world's most unique marine areas.
These pristine gems, these pristine refuges, these pristine sanctuaries that want to thrive, just let them thrive and celebrate it and realize how special they are.
Norway wants to be a leader in ocean conservation. They want to be a leader in climate change. And so in their own backyard, they have the best opportunity to create a shining beacon of hope for the world.
To wrap up very quickly. To wrap up very quickly, how many people here live in Norway? No one. One person. Well, the rest of you don't need to help support the movement that's taking place by joining our global audience of 25 million, if not more, that we reach on a daily basis and participating in the change. Thank you. Thank you. Okay, so from beauty to less than beautiful. The next 5 minutes are going to be a little bit depressing, but I promise that in the Q&A we're going to focus on the hope and solutions. So I'm here today to set the context for plastic pollution. It's an interesting problem because it's one that's global, it's visible, we know it's harmful, but it's also solvable. Plastic is a miracle material that has become an environmental scourge. So this map shows a ton of information, but the bottom line is pretty bleak. At this point, plastic waste has been found from the Arctic to the Antarctic and from the surface to the sea floor. About 40% of the plastic we use today is used just once and then tossed. And that chain from production to purchase through to disposal offers lots of opportunities for leakage. About 9 million tons of plastic is getting to the ocean every year. So it's a huge number. Think about 5 plastic grocery bags full of plastic trash for every 1 foot of coastline. Still hard to envision. Okay, picture 5 plastic grocery bags sitting on your own lap right now. And to your right and your left, your neighbors have those same giant piles sitting on their laps. Now extend that chain around every coastline of the world. You start to get the picture. It's a huge amount of waste. And when you think about that waste making its way out to the ocean, and we have one global ocean with currents that can carry waste from one shoreline around the world, you start to get a picture for the kind of crisis we're getting into. But the question is, how did we get into this mess in the first place? So back in the mid-1800s, plastics, the very first developed from plants as celluloid, were produced to become an alternate material to things that were expensive and frankly grossly unsustainable, like ivory. So it was a great, cheap alternative. Things like combs and billiard balls and piano keys suddenly were able to be produced without killing hundreds of thousands of elephants along the way. But in just a couple short decades, we figured out how to make plastic from petroleum, and that produced a massive leap in technology. In 1955, Life magazine had this amazing picture of an American family celebrating the dawn of throwaway living. These disposable plastics were going to free the modern housewife from the burden of dishes. And as we all know, this has been, to say the least, a mixed blessing. Yes, these plastics have brought huge convenience to our lives, but it's also these same disposable plastics are what represent the majority of waste that's getting out into the environment every year. So since 1950, we've seen an incredible growth. Can you head back one slide, please? While it may not have been the dawn of throwaway living, it certainly was the dawn of the plastics boom. And in the years since 1950, we've produced over 8 billion metric tons of plastic. And the incredible part of that is 50% of it is from just the last 15 years. And under our current trajectory, we're set to hit 34 billion metric tons by 2050. Most of that, about half of that, the biggest market, is for packaging materials. These are materials that are used for 6 months or less, and most of it isn't recycled. It's either landfilled, incinerated, or in the worst case, and what's happening more and more, is ending up leaked out into our environment. So with plastic only set to increase in the coming years, we've got to get a handle on this before it's too late. So one of the things that makes plastic incredible is also why it ends up in the environment. It's light. Its lightness means that it can travel on the wind and on the waves. But its lightness is also why plastics probably won't go away, and why we have to figure out better ways to make plastic and to deal with plastic. So imagine all of these bottles you see in this plastic made of glass. Imagine hundreds of thousands of glass bottles being shipped around the world, and the weight that represents, and then the difference in weight if those bottles are plastic. That weight difference equals carbon emissions. We can't ignore that if we're gonna live in a globalized society, we have to figure out how are we gonna move products around the world in a way that's gonna reach people who need access, but also isn't going to cause harm. So the problem with plastics is less about the plastic itself and more about that it's ending up where it doesn't belong, in places like the ocean, where it can break down over time and enter our food chain. The other problem with plastics is that once it gets out into the ocean, you sure as heck aren't going to be able to get it anymore, right? Once it's broken down into microplastics and is super small, the amount of cost, if it's even possible, is astronomical to try and collect it. So let's start focusing on preventing it from getting there in the first place. Let's look up into our rivers and up onto land and put in the prevention solutions to capture waste, to lessen the use of waste, to make sure that we're never allowing it to get out into the ocean in the first place. I promise I'll come back with some hope and solutions in discussion, but I'm going to hand it off to Shilpi to continue the conversation.
Hi, everybody. So great to be here. Thank you to Julia and the Grounded team for having me. I am Shilpi Chotre. I am the Senior Communications Officer for the Break Free from Plastic movement. We are a group of 1,400 organizations working all around the world at all points in the plastic pollution life cycle. So as Valerie teed up in her presentation, we know ocean plastic is a massive problem, but plastic pollutes at every stage of its life, from extraction to production to consumption to disposal. So our group and our movement is working for systemic change worldwide to get to the root cause of the problem. So we don't really focus on end-of-pipe measures like cleanup, because we cannot clean up ourselves out of this mess. What's also unique about our movement is that we do work at a global scale, and our colleagues in the US, in Europe, and Southeast Asia and China are working collaboratively at a peer-to-peer level. This is extremely important right now because, as you've seen in mainstream media, in certain plastics dialogues we're having, and even in the Trump administration, Southeast Asia is predominantly being blamed for the plastic problem. This is a huge concern for those of us in the movement that believe in human justice and social equity. It is corporations in the global north that are creating this problematic packaging to begin with, and then opening markets predatorily in areas of the world like Asia, Latin America, and Africa, knowing very well they don't have the infrastructure to manage this type of waste. It's simply unmanageable. Second, we have been shipping our waste overseas to China for decades. Only 9% of our waste in the US has been recycled since the 1950s. So let that sink in. The blue bin is not going to save the day. In January 1st of 2018, China decided that they would no longer take the world's waste. They were being treated like a dumping ground. which is really, really powerful. However, it's caused catastrophic ramifications in the global waste trade. We have waste in the US and Europe piling up in ports all over our countries and nations with nowhere for this waste to go. Secondly, because China is no longer taking the waste, it is now being diverted to other areas of Southeast Asia, like Vietnam, India, Thailand, Malaysia. So no one or other country should be bearing the brunt of this toxic industry. We need to figure out how to manage waste at the domestic level and figure out recycling here. Okay, I know that was a little heavy, so we'll get to some fun stuff now. As I mentioned in the opening slide, we don't focus on coastal cleanup, but we do focus on the brand audit. How many of you have participated in a coastal cleanup before? Wonderful. So it is a great way to raise awareness and get involved in your local community. What we're doing is asking folks to take their coastal cleanup to the next level by incorporating a brand audit. So we're not only looking at the types of plastic found in the waste stream, but the brands responsible for this waste to begin with. And we do this at the global level. This is a snapshot of our first ever global brand audit that was pioneered in September this year. 6 continents, 42 countries, 9,000 volunteers, and you'll see 187,851 pieces of plastic pollution that were categorized and cataloged. All of this information went into the same data set so we can create this report that we would use in corporate campaigning, in all of our communications, to influence policymakers. And here are the results of the report. I also want to mention, just a couple days ago, Coke disclosed that they use 3 million tons of plastic a year. I know that's hard to visualize, so let's picture a blue whale. Beautiful, massive animal. Now picture 15,000 of them. That is 3 million tons. So we are seeing a direct correlation with the branded trash that we're finding in our global cleanups and what corporations are putting out as they're reporting. So I only have a few seconds here. I wanted to talk about accountability and bring it back to the narrative around it's not consumers are to blame, it's corporations are to blame. Thank you. And I'll leave you with one startling statistic. Also, let's keep it as an opportunity. Plastic production is slated to increase by 40% in the next decade. We have to hold industry accountable and let them know we are imagining a different world and we know it's possible. I'd love to connect to stop plastic pollution, stop making plastic. That is essentially what our movement is all about.
So let's talk about solutions. I am Daniela Russo. I am the founder of Chief Executive Officer of Think Beyond Plastic, and we're an innovation accelerator. We met Julia at Davos at the World Economic Forum in January, and since then we've been on this path of discovery of what is needed to support innovation as a way of solving the problem of plastic pollution. At Think Beyond Plastic, we focus on the problems worth solving. We call them wicked problems. Wicked problems is a term well known from design language, but also in business. And they're characterized with problems that are difficult to solve due to the scale, to the incomplete or contradicting information, or changing data. Wicked problems affect large groups of people. Wicked problems are really resistant to solution. There is no determinable stopping point. And one solution typically creates another problem. Because what happens if we get rid of plastic? Plastic has a lot of really good uses. What happens if we start investing in recycling infrastructures? We're part of a big project right now to figure out what would it take to build recycling infrastructures in Southeast Asia. And I can tell you that the numbers are phenomenal to just build recycling enough to manage a little bit more of collection and management of this plastic waste. It's in the trillions. So these are wicked problems. This is a global wicked problem. Plastic pollution is a wicked problem. So because we're gluttons for punishment, we chose this to deal with. We're a group of innovators and entrepreneurs. I spent 30 years of my life in Silicon Valley, starting and running businesses, ran the starting bell on NASDAQ, took companies public. My business partner has a background in biotech. And so we look at the plastic pollution problem as an untapped innovation and investment opportunity. It's largely untapped. To us, these are not problems. They're solutions waiting to be addressed. Plastic has brought enormous benefits to society. It's brought enormous damages. And plastic as a material has inherent design flaws. Think about how we use it. This is a material that's been millions of years in the making, and we use it to throw stuff away. This is a material that we already know leaches the toxic chemicals and compounds that are used in its manufacture into the food and drink it contains, yet we use it to deliver food and drink. And this is a material that's very lightweight and prone to littering, yet we use it specifically for stuff that is to be taken away. And we use it in increasingly amounts in that way. So we took a step back as we examined the problem and said, perhaps there is another way to look at all this. Plastic, it has inherent design flaws. So what if we redesign that? This is my old presentation, by the way, you guys. So I'm sorry you put that in. But we look into the plastic pollution problem as a moonshot innovation opportunity. We call it the moonshot innovation opportunity because when we decided to go to the moon, it required mobilization on an unprecedented scale. It marshaled resources, it brought interdisciplinary collaboration, it required government support, it required investors, innovators, and entrepreneurs. It is nothing short than that. So we're looking into creating a generation of materials that are biobenign, not plastic in its current form, which is petroleum product made, as I said, millions of years in the making, but biobenign materials that are sustainably grown, sustainably manufactured, and with a sustainable end of life. That could be agricultural waste. It could be materials that are derived by enzymatic pathways, but they're all biobenign. They can break down to their natural elements. That is not enough. We're looking into a new generation of chemistry, which is green chemistry, which will create the compounds that are currently used in plastics out of sustainable sources. So they're not endocrine disrupting chemicals. The flexibilizers and the paints and the colors, all of that stuff can be made out of sustainable materials. And last but not least, we're looking into a generation of product delivery that is based on a service model that is essential to the circular economy. We live in the age of a gig economy, so we're all about services. So why do we still deliver products in the same essential way of putting stuff on the shelf in boxes with pretty packaging that then becomes waste? So we're looking into the circular economy for packaging and where the innovation opportunities are, and they are multiple. Our focus is on the left side where it's the red color. So we're looking into creating the new materials that will support the new chemistry, that will support all the associated innovations in that space. That space is largely underfunded right now. On the right-hand side, there are millions of dollars in commitment to sorting, recycling, transportation that is already well understood, and industry would love to support that because it does not in any way threaten their business model. So the message there is keep making plastic, keep throwing away, we can recycle and collect it. It's not possible. So what is needed really is a level of innovation that will be upstream innovation, that will bring the new materials, the new product delivery models, and we need to support that kind of innovation. It requires an innovation ecosystem. Everybody is a participant there. What Shilpi and Valerie talked about is demand creation on an unprecedented scale for new products, new materials, everything new. So that's the demand creation piece. The innovators will rise to the occasion. The entrepreneurs will bring these companies to the fore. And investors such as Full Cycle and others will support that and invest funding to make that happen. So we've created the Catalytic Innovation Fund. The biggest problem the innovators are facing today with regards to investment is that everybody wants to invest in a market-ready company. And of course, that's understood. That's the risk company that somebody has evaluated and helped transition through the valley of death. But the longest journey for these entrepreneurs is from the 50 grams of material with a patent pending in a university to creating a minimum viable prototype that industry might be interested in licensing. It's a long journey, it's a perilous journey, it's unnaturally long. It's not like the Valley of Death in any other industry, except perhaps in biotech. And it needs help and resources. Most of these companies die on the vine right there. So we look into supporting them with funding. We'll look also into, and we've created an innovation infrastructure, which is essentially access to labs. Because these companies are heavy on science, they require access to lab equipment, which is rarely found outside of the academic environment. Some of our partners, industry partners, offer their labs, but if you're an innovator developing a new product, would you go and use the Dow Chemical lab? Probably not. Not the Unilever lab either. So it has to be a pre-competitive space where there could be these developments and access to equipment. Normally, government grants do not give you access to equipment or the ability to purchase that. So we've created an innovation infrastructure throughout Europe. This year, we're opening some innovation centers in Africa to support that. It's not possible without partners. And what is really important for me to share with you is we work with industry. In a weird dichotomy, industry is one of the biggest customers for these new products. So it's impossible to work without them. Trust me, Coca-Cola knows exactly what their customer problem is. All of the major consumer brands know what the problem is. They need to work towards anticipating the changing customer shift in behavior and needs and attitudes and be prepared for this. They know it very well. So we work with a whole group of mentors from these companies, teaching and training the entrepreneurs on what is needed, what are the price performance characteristics that are required, and how they need to develop a product for which they will become customers. I can talk more about this later, and if you want to see the flip-flops made of algae or some prototypes that are available right now, come and take a look at our booth. We also have an investor forum on June 11th, where we will bring in investors willing to participate and support these entrepreneurs with early stage innovation seed grants. So thank you.